Perfect. So, welcome to the first installment of the Prosperity Indiana Advocacy 101 series. Today's webinar is being co-hosted by the Indiana Coalition for Human Services as well. Today's webinar is called Advocacy 101, The Rules. And this is a part of, again, a three-part webinar series that is designed to help you prepare to advocate for the policies needed in the communities that you serve. So today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording as well as the slide decks will be shared with everyone who registered for the event, even if they were unable to attend live. So thank you all for being here live today. That's great. To get us warmed up and ready to engage with our wonderful speaker that we have joining us today, let's all introduce ourselves. So please write in the chat your name, organization, and what it is you do. And I'll go first as an example. My name is Hale Crumley, and I am the policy manager at Prosperity Indiana. So I create and coordinate opportunities like this for our members and partners to engage advocates. I also convene our statewide advocacy coalitions. So now it's your turn. Again, please go ahead in the chat and write your name, organization, and what you do so that we can all figure out who's on the call with us today. And while you're doing that, introducing yourself, I want to take a moment to introduce one of the hosts of today's webinar. For those who may not be familiar with us yet, Prosperity Indiana is Indiana's statewide association for community economic development. In other words, we are a membership-based organization for nonprofits, local governments, banks, and really all community-serving organizations and individuals who are committed to strengthening their communities. So we have around 200 members covering all 92 of Indiana's counties. And there's some resources that we offer to the public here at Prosperity Indiana, including webinars like this one, and reports and other public events. However, official Prosperity Indiana members get so much more. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, please reach out to us or check out our membership page. But next, I want to offer Andrew Bradley the chance to introduce the second co-host of today's event. Andrew?
Thanks, Hale. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Bradley. I'm proud to be Hale's colleague at Prosperity Indiana, where I'm Senior Director of Policy and Strategy. And another hat that I wear is I'm the volunteer board president of the Indiana Coalition for Human Services. If you don't know ICHS, you can see here, we've been around since the mid-'80s. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition of advocacy and human service organizations that engages, educates, and mobilizes decision makers, its stakeholders, and the public on fact-based, equitable public policies resulting in quality outcomes for all Hoosiers. So I will say that I really encourage you to check out both Prosperity Indiana and ICHS. Each of those groups would love to have you and your organization as members. I'll say from the ICHS standpoint, something we have coming up this next Monday is our annual membership meeting, and we'll also be having a special conversation with Indiana Public Media State House Bureau Chief Brandon Smith. And then looking ahead to December 19th, we're going to have a State Budget 101 session with Liza Sherman, who's the Deputy Director of Fiscal Policy for the Indiana House of Representatives. So that's another good reason to get involved with ICHS as well as Prosperity Indiana. And one last thing I'll say is it's great to see Alan. I've had the pleasure of having heard this training from him before about half a decade ago. So really excited that we're able to bring his resources to the ICHS and Prosperity Indiana memberships and partners today. Back to you, Hale.
Thanks so much. Well, with that, let's get started talking about the rules that you need to know when it comes to educating versus lobbying and what things nonprofits can do. So I'm now going to unshare my screen and hand things over to our speaker today. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Hale, and thank you all for joining today. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk with you all today. As Hale mentioned, what we're going to talk about today are the rules in the big picture, but more specifically, thinking about how do we leverage these rules so that we can be as effective as possible as organizations that are engaging in advocacy in Indiana. my background before I became a lawyer, all I do all day as a lawyer is work with nonprofits. And before I went to law school, I worked in politics and at nonprofits in the advocacy realm. And I know that what typically happens in the advocacy space is not that organizations are getting in trouble all the time. What typically happens is organizations hold back because as an advocate, if you don't know exactly what the definition of lobbying is, if you don't know exactly where that line is, you're likely to hold back trying to err on the side of caution. Because you don't want to get your hand slapped, you don't want to jeopardize future funding from foundations, you don't want to get in trouble with the board. What tends to happen then is if the line for what's lobbying and non-lobbying is up here, people tend to hang way back over here and they stop when they do something that's like, oh, that kind of smells like it might be lobbying, so I better stop. Foundations and other funders really want you to get your toes right up to the line. Foundations understand that if you're not spending your grant money to its full effectiveness, then you're not using that grant in the way that the foundation wanted you to, because foundations want you to be using grants as powerfully and efficiently and effectively as possible. And so what we're going to talk about today is what are those rules? And then what's the strategy that we can apply so that we can get our toes right up to the line, so that we can be making all of the different pots of money that we have available as an organization, make those money go as far as possible so that we can save our advocacy dollars for lobbying for when they're really going to have the biggest bang for the buck. And so we'll talk about that strategy today. I always think that the strategy part of this is more interesting than just what are the rules, what are the do and don'ts. I think it's a lot more interesting to think about like the how to and how do we get to a place where we can be as powerful as possible. I've got the chat box open here. Please feel free to post questions in the chat as we go along. If there's something that you don't understand, it's likely that your colleagues also don't understand it just because I didn't explain it well. And so everyone's going to appreciate if you go ahead and ask those questions. Some of the questions I might be addressing a little bit later in the webinar, and so I'll get to those later. And some questions, as you ask them, I'll just answer them as we go. But I really do appreciate people's participation and willingness to ask questions. And I'm going to have a bunch of questions that I'd like you guys to answer as we go along too. So the basic rule here is that the IRS imposes limits on what lobbying Section 501c3 organizations can do. And there's two types of 501c3s. There's what are called public charities, which are most of the groups on this call, frankly. Public charities are organizations that are funded from a variety of sources. You're doing fundraising from individuals, maybe in the community, maybe you're getting foundation grants, getting money from government or corporate sources. The definition of a public charity is just a 501c3 that's getting money from a bunch of different places. And the important thing I want people to understand here is that 501c3 public charities are totally allowed to engage in lobbying under the IRS definitions. We'll talk about what is and what isn't lobbying, but I just want you to know that if you're a public charity, meaning you do any kind of fundraising, you're allowed to do lobbying. The challenge here is that the other type of 501c3, private foundations, meaning groups that are funded just by one family or one company, or for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, funded by the Gateses and their buddy Warren Buffett kicking in money, but it's a limited pool. They're not going out and doing fundraising. Those private foundations, which are the ones that are writing the grants to your organizations, they cannot directly pay for lobbying. So what you're going to see is in your foundation grant agreements, there's going to be language in there that says you're not allowed to use that grant for being used. There's likely to be language that says you're not allowed to use that grant money for lobbying. Now, there are a couple of loopholes that we're not going to get into where you are allowed to use it. But for the most part, the foundation grants that you're getting are going to have that prohibition that says you can't use that money for lobbying. And if your grant prohibits lobbying, then you need to understand what is lobbying so that we can use that grant for everything that's not lobbying. We want to be thinking about these foundation grants expansively so that we can use those foundation grants for anything that's defined as not lobbying. Now, what we're going to talk about today and these restrictions that come with these foundation grants, they're only involving the IRS rules about lobbying. And specifically, it's what are called the Section 501H rules. I'm not going to get into an explanation of that here. It's a little bit technical and frankly boring if you're not a tax lawyer. But I'll send around with the slides afterwards. I'll send around a short explanation. The bottom line is that there's two different ways to measure lobbying activities. The foundation grants use the definitions we're going to talk about today. And if your organization has a budget of under like $20 million, your organization should be using these definitions as well. And I'll circulate those definitions, or Hale will after the webinar. But the important thing to understand here is that the IRS definitions we're going to talk about today that are applicable to the limits on 501c3 lobbying, they differ from the definitions that Congress has for lobbying, and frankly, the definitions in Indiana law about who needs to register and report as a lobbyist. So for example, under Indiana law, lobbying is defined as being efforts to influence executive branch action and legislation. Under the IRS rules, it's only efforts to influence legislation. So there's a lot of activity under Indiana law where you might have to file reports with the state and say, hey, we were lobbying, I'm a lobbyist, and this is the lobbying we did. And then you turn around and tell the IRS or you tell your foundation funders, no, we didn't do any lobbying because we were trying to influence an executive branch decision. We were trying to influence some sort of administrative regulation from the health department. None of those count as lobbying under the IRS rules, even though they're lobbying under Indiana law. So there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance in that, and that you just have to understand that there are times where we're allowed to use our foundation non-lobbying funds for stuff that we have to turn around and report to the state of Indiana. But once you understand that the IRS rules and the state rules don't exactly mesh, it's not that hard to understand, okay, we're doing something with non-lobbying grant funds, even though we might have to report it to Indiana, for example. Now, I want to address sort of a big elephant in the room, which is a lot of the people on this call, your organization might not do any lobbying. You might be saying to yourself, hey, our organization doesn't do any lobbying, or I work for a county agency, or a state agency. As part of a government agency, we're not allowed to do any lobbying because of the government rules. You know, I'm not at a 501c3 organization. I'm limited in what I can do. That makes perfect sense. And what I want people to understand here is that trying to get policy changed takes everybody in a large ecosystem. You know, whether you're an academic or a government agency or a clergy, for example, all of these people have a role to play, have a really important role to play in policy change. And so, for example, the researchers should be out there talking to folks at advocacy groups to understand what research, what data do the people at the advocacy groups need in order to implement policies. And I'm going to address later on during our presentation ways that the researchers' reports and the advocates' efforts can mesh so that the researchers using purely non-lobbying money can help those advocates make their arguments most powerfully. You know, if you're at a government agency, often you have a trove of data to prove points about why policy change is needed. You can't go ahead and make those arguments, perhaps, to a legislator, but the folks from the advocacy groups or the educational groups could take your data and make those arguments eloquently. So be engaged with talking to the people from the policy shops to see what it is that they need and how you can help them. The people at the policy organizations, might not even know that your government agency has that important data that would be the missing link for them to be able to advocate for their policies. If you're a direct service provider, think about what you can do. Can you host legislator visits to your sites? Can you put voter registration information at the front desk? For example, if you're a YMCA or you're a Head Start organization, you can put out nonpartisan voter registration information to help make sure that all of the clients of your Head Start or YMCA are engaged in policy. Make sure that you're getting clergy involved. They have a tremendous amount of outreach to their congregations where they can both advocate for policy from the pulpit, and they can also help to make sure that you're engaging with the right people. There's no limit when we start thinking creatively about all of the different ways that we can engage all the different people and groups within this ecosystem of policy change. So even if your organization is not directly focused on policy change, or your board of directors says, hey, we're not going to cross the line into lobbying, there's a huge panoply of activities that we can be engaged in that will help to drive that policy change. No one organization is going to get any kind of legislative change across the line. It's going to take, as we have on this very call, we have something like 80 plus organizations on this call. And all of the organizations have to work in concert, and every group has a role to play in getting those policy changes made, whether it's in the legislature or in the executive branch or at the state or at the local level or in Congress. So think about the role that you can play. All right, enough setup. What are the rules? What are the two types? What are the kinds of lobbying that the IRS regulates here? Well, they define it as two different types of lobbying. And I'll send around a cheat sheet with these definitions, but there's direct lobbying, which are communications directly with legislators and their staff. And then there's grassroots lobbying, which are going to be communications to the public that are a bank shot, right? You're trying to talk to the public in order to get them to reach out to influence their lawmakers. Now, for direct lobbying, it has to have all three of these elements. And if it doesn't have all three elements, it just isn't going to be treated as direct lobbying. So it's going to be a communication directly with the legislator or staffer on specific legislation, and it has to reflect the organization's view on that legislation. So we're really talking here about things like emails and phone calls, meetings with legislators or their staff. So a good example would be a client of mine bought a giant billboard outside of the district office of a local state senator. And on that billboard, it said, Senator Fernandez, vote yes on S-226 to keep kids healthy. That doesn't count as direct lobbying because that billboard, even though we know Senator Fernandez is going to see it every time she and her staff go in and out of their district office, that billboard's a public communication. Anyone who drove by that strip mall where the district office is located was going to see that billboard, right? So that's not covered. We're only talking about direct communications directly with legislators and their staff. Lindsay, I'm really glad to hear that's a tactic you guys have engaged in Indiana too. I love it. All right, so it's a communication directly with a legislator or staffer about specific legislation. Now, obviously, that's going to be bills that have been introduced. It also covers ballot measures because a ballot measure is basically putting a bill to the voters, and the voters are essentially like an ancient Greek direct democracy, where the voters are going to vote to implement a law for their jurisdiction. The challenge here really is the gray area, is what I've got marked here in red, specific legislative proposals that haven't been introduced yet. Now, by that I mean, or what the IRS means, are communications to a legislator that are specific enough that that legislator is going to know exactly what you want them to introduce. So for example, if you say to a legislator, hey, we need to raise the minimum wage in Indiana to make sure that all families have enough food on the table and a roof over their head. That's not specific legislation. So that doesn't count as lobbying if you say that to a legislator. If you just say to a legislator, hey, we need to raise the minimum wage, because they don't know what they want, what you want them to introduce. Compare that with talking to a legislator and saying to them, hey, we need to raise the minimum wage in Indiana to $15 an hour and eliminate the discrepancy for tipped workers by 2027. Now the legislator knows exactly what you want them to introduce, and that would be treated as specific legislation. And so it would be viewed as direct lobbying. And we can use that. We can leverage that important distinction by talking to legislators about general policy issues, and that's not going to be treated as direct lobbying. So you can have those conversations with legislators about general policy issues, and you can pay for your time in that conversation. You can pay for it with that restricted private foundation grant. You can make sure that as you're talking to those legislators, think about what strategically you're looking to accomplish and how expensive is the time that you're spending with that legislator. And if it's a really expensive situation, like you're taking them on a tour of a community, and it's going to be an all-day kind of thing, maybe you want to set it up so that you're not talking about legislation, you're just talking about general policy issues, so you can pay for it with your foundation grant. On the other hand, maybe it's a situation where you're talking to a legislator, they need to get a bill passed. By all means, you should be lobbying them. I don't want your takeaway from this to be like, oh, that lawyer from DC said we shouldn't be lobbying. Not at all. My point is just be strategic about when we're lobbying so that we can use our lobbying dollars as efficiently and effectively as possible and save our non-lobbying grant money for when it's going to be really useful. So here's an example. And I'm going to do something a lawyer is never supposed to do. I'm going to ask a question where I don't know the answer. So Andrew, if you could come off of mute. So here's an event from last summer where a staffer from Representative Sparks' office came to see new cottages that had been built to expand affordable housing in the community. And it says in this, tweet, Congress should protect and expand housing assistance to protect vulnerable families. So Andrew, was this event, forget the tweet or the event itself, was this lobbying or non-lobbying activity?
This particular event really was non-lobbying. I think this was meant to be education and connecting Representative Sparks' staff with partners. Now, we followed up with some lobbying asks, but we didn't do lobbying asks during this specific meeting.
That's great. All right. So thank goodness I asked a question. I got an answer that I wanted. I've been debating whether or not in my head, like, hey, do I want to ask Andrew this question? So I'm really, really glad you handled it the right way, Andrew. That's good. The reason it wasn't lobbying is they didn't talk about legislation, right? They're talking about the need for housing. They're talking about the housing that's being built in their local communities within Representative Sparks' district. And they're having a big picture policy discussion saying, hey, Congress should protect and expand housing assistance to support vulnerable families. But this event with Representative Sparks' staff is expensive, right? It takes a bunch of days to plan it. You got to work on scheduling, both with the Congresswoman's office and with the local housing group that's being built. You've got to get partners there. It takes a whole lot of staff time to set this thing up. So it makes sense to try to use non-lobbying dollars to do that. Now, when you do a local site visit like this, if you're going to use non-lobbying dollars, it's helpful to reach out to the Congresswoman or her staffer ahead of time and say, hey, we're excited to show you these new units that have been built in Fishers, but I want you to understand that because of the foundation funding that we have, we're not going to be talking about any legislation on this visit. Now, as Andrew indicated, legislators and staffers love to legislate. So they're going to want to set up a meeting afterwards and say, hey, what can we do to protect housing? How can we help to get more of these cottages built? And so that's a good time to set up a future, say, hey, today's site visit is just so you guys can understand the big picture policy implications. I'd love to set up a future visit with you. Let's get on the call next week. Let's get on the phone next week, and I can talk to you about legislation that's going to be in Congress or legislation we'd love to work on with Representative Sparks to get that done. But today we're not going to talk about particular bills. We just want to make sure that you understand the big picture policy issue. And so that's a great way to do it. And I'm really glad that that's how it worked out, Andrew. So just to review, direct lobbying or communications on legislation and the reflective view on that legislation. The other type of lobbying is grassroots lobbying. And these are communications to the public. Like this is that billboard outside of Representative Fernandez's district office, or this is the billboard that Lindsay over at Citizens Action Coalition put up outside of innumerable members' offices, apparently. So here we've got to have 4 elements. It's a communication to the public, everything from a tweet to that billboard, reflects a view on specific legislation, and it has to have what the IRS defines as being a call to action. And so if it's a communication to the public about legislation that doesn't have a call to action, it's just not lobbying. So that means we can put out all sorts of public communications about bills as long as it doesn't have what the IRS defines as being a call to action. And that IRS definition, the most important prong is asking people to contact their legislator. And if it was, if it was that easy, we could circumvent this 6 ways to Sunday. So the IRS also says, in addition to saying, call your legislator, it's also things that give people enough of a nudge to want to contact their legislator. So for example, saying Representative Sparks is your congresswoman or providing contact information for a legislator. Identifying a legislator as being neutral or opposed to our position on the bill. So for example, on that billboard, if the billboard said if Senator Fernandez, get off the fence and vote yes, then if I was driving by, I would be like, hey, that's really important. I should give Senator Fernandez a call. But if the billboard just said, yay, Senator Fernandez, we're so glad you're going to do the right thing, well, that's terrific. She's going to do the right thing, and I'm a busy person, so now I don't have to take time out of my day to call her. It also includes providing like a vehicle for contacting the legislator, like a form letter or petition or something like that. But what I want you guys to think about is think strategically about when to include a call to action on your communications. How expensive is that public communication? And how many calls is it going to generate? Like that billboard for the folks on the Financial Services Committee. It's expensive to buy that many billboards, and people driving by a billboard probably aren't going to call the Financial Services Committee. So putting a call to action on that billboard isn't going to be terribly effective, but it's going to force you to use lobbying dollars for that billboard. I'll give you another example. A client of mine was working on a city campaign to pass funding for sidewalks, crosswalks, and public transit. And they came to me and they wanted to do bus wraps, right? You can buy those bus wraps. They were going to spend $100,000 on bus wraps, asking people to call their city council members. But they didn't have that much grassroots lobbying money. So what we did is we restructured it. On the bus wraps, we said the city council should pass funding for sidewalks, crosswalks, and public transit. But it didn't have an IRS call to action on those buses. So they spent $60,000 on these bus wraps just to generate a whole lot of attention for this budget bill, right? Anyone driving around the city, and most importantly, the city council members, would see these buses calling attention to this issue. And it got a lot of exposure to the issue, but they could use the non-lobbying foundation grant money for those bus wraps. And then what they did was the smart part. They spent $10,000 on ads in bus shelters. And those bus shelter ads are super cheap. So they got all the bus shelter ads in the whole city. And the people who are in those shelters They're the ones who use sidewalks, crosswalks, and public transit by definition. They've got a phone in their hands and they've got time in their hands because the buses aren't running often enough because they needed more funding. So we put a QR code in every one of those bus shelters where people could click the QR code and immediately get contacted to their city council member based on the zip code in which they live. And so people could directly contact those city council members. So for $10,000, we generated a ton of calls to the city council because we were spending a cheaper amount of money, but it was much more targeted. So they used $10,000 of grassroots lobbying dollars to really generate a ton of calls. And then they used $60,000 of non-lobbying foundation money to generate more attention and exposure for their issue. So think through which tactics are going to generate contacts and invest your grassroots lobbying dollars on those tactics specifically, and leave the call to action off when you've got different tactics that you're engaging in that are useful, but that aren't going to generate as many contacts to the city council or the state legislature. I'll pause there for a second to see if people have questions about those definitions of direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. If you've got questions, just throw them in the chat.
You must just be so thorough, Alan.
As questions come in, I'll still address them. Two things I want to mention about this is that if you're conducting activities that are aimed at just lobbying, then it's an expense that has to be generated for lobbying. So for example, if you're having a strategy meeting where you're talking about lobby day and setting up lobby day, you need to code your time for that strategy meeting as lobbying activity. Or for example, if you're writing handouts that are only going to be used at lobby day, then you need to pay for those handouts with lobbying dollars. But I want you to think strategically about the arc of your campaign. The flip side of that rule is that if you create materials that you distribute broadly to the public that are non-lobbying activities, you can use those materials later on for lobbying, and it won't change the underlying expense into a lobbying expense. So for example, if you write a report about legislation and distribute that report broadly to the public to educate the public about the legislation, and it doesn't have a call to action on that report is non-lobbying. You can later on, or more importantly, your coalition allies later on can use that report when they're doing their own lobbying activity. And your expense won't become a lobbying expense. So for example, if you're a research organization, sorry about my dog barking in the background, I think you just saw a fox. If you're a research organization, writing these reports is really time intensive, so it's expensive. You want to charge that expense off to a non-lobbying grant. And think about it, right? If you've got a call to action on page 72 of this report about the future of eviction record sealing, no one gets to page 72 of this report and says, call your legislator, and they're like, oh, I better call my legislator, right? They've already been convinced. So if you have an expensive communication, use non-lobbying dollars to invest in it, but make sure that all of your coalition allies get access to this report so that they can use it for their lobbying. And also in terms of the arc of your campaign, so you've got those materials ready for lobby day when it comes later on in the year. So one of the questions that came up in the chat box was, what money can be used for lobbying, right? And I'm really glad you asked that. The question is, you get all of these grants from foundations. The foundation grants probably say no lobbying. Any money that you're getting from individuals, all of it can be used for lobbying. The money you're getting from corporations that are donating, that money can be used for lobbying. Often money you get from other 501c3s, sometimes that can be used for lobbying, sometimes not. Or if you're getting contributions from 501c4s, it can be used for lobbying. But I would say that the primary source of money for lobbying is going to be money that you raise from individuals or unrestricted general support grants from foundations where they're not giving it to you for a particular project. So thank you for asking that question. So what I want to talk about one other example, particular exception here before we get into some examples. And the exception here that I want to talk about is for testimony. So if you are asked by a Senate, by any kind of a legislative committee, whether it's a subcommittee, a committee, a whole body, if you receive a request from the chair asking you to testify or asking you to provide information, that's going to be a non-lobbying expense when you go ahead and testify. Now, there's a bunch of caveats to this, but the idea here is that the IRS wants to make sure that its lobbying rules aren't stopping government bodies from getting valuable information from the experts. And so the request needs to be coming from the committee chair asking on behalf of the whole committee. It can't just be some crazy backbencher who agrees with your issue who's inviting you to testify. Having it come from the committee chair on behalf of the committee is going to show that it is a valuable, important request that's valuable to the committee. Now, even if the committee chair is hostile to your issue, if you get another member of the minority party, for example, to ask that committee chair to issue one of these letters, they'll usually do it no problem at all because it doesn't cost them any money. They'll just do it out of professional courtesy to the member of the minority party. And these letters are like a Willy Wonka golden ticket, right? You can use non-lobbying foundation money to write and research your testimony, to travel to the state capitol. You might have to stay over at the capitol. All of those expenses are going to be treated as non-lobbying expenses that you can use foundation money for if you foundation grant money and say it's a non-lobbying expense, even if you're testifying about a bill. Yeah, so so Andrew asks, can the testimony, so let me go to answer Lindsay's slightly snarky question. It has to be in writing. Now, all right, so maybe Minnesota's got a legit legislature. I'm not going to opine on that at all. But all I will tell you in this situation here, I'm pointing at the screen, like you can see what I'm pointing at. This letter that I wrote this letter for Rachel. Rachel Callahan was the Minnesota lobbyist for the Heart Association at the time. I wrote this letter. I emailed it to Rachel. She forwarded it to the chief of staff of the committee. The chief of staff just cut and pasted my letter word for word and put it on committee letterhead, had her boss sign it, and emailed it back to Rachel. Now, I don't know if that's legit or not, but that's the way legislatures work. And you should be able to, well, if you want to use this exception, you need the committee chairs in Indiana to at least take a letter that we write and have them copy and paste it onto letterhead and send it back to them. So for the most part, it is something that can be done. It's really not hard for them to do, to cut and paste and put it on letterhead. And it gives you this Willy Wonka golden ticket where you can then go and advocate for a particular bill or advocate against a particular bill because you've got this request letter, and you can use that non-lobbying money to pay for all of that. It needs to be available to everybody on the committee. It can't be something where you just provide information just to the chairman and write a letter with write a bill with the chairman. Deb asks a good question about when do you need to register as a lobbyist if you testify at committee meetings and contact legislators' office about particular bills. I'm not going to dive into the details of Indiana registration and reporting. I think probably what we'll do is circulate a memo out to folks so that you've got something in writing. or we'll provide information on that. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritties of those details because typically what happens is you're going to want to have that information as a resource going forward into the future. As scintillating as a Friday afternoon webinar may be, you're probably not going to remember all of the details on Monday. So you'd want to have a handout on that. So I want to go through a couple of examples here to see what people think. Let folks play, you guys can all be the lawyer here. So the first one is the fact sheet about a bill. And what I want you guys to do is to vote in the chat box whether you think this is direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying, or is it totally non-lobbying? This is, and I know that the print is really small. This is the fact sheet about a bill that Prosperity Indiana wrote. And it says, and I'm going to ask Hale and Andrew not to vote first on this one. It talks about the 2024 child tax credit expansion, about why the bill is good. It says why this, who's going to benefit from this important bill. It's especially important to families living in rural areas. This legislation is going to improve the child tax credit. It includes a statement that says visit prosperityindiana.org/ANO to learn more about the coalition. Vote in the chat box. Do you think this is direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying, or is it non-lobbying? And on any of those three answers, explain why. Don't just say lobbying or non-lobbying. Explain why you think it's direct or grassroots lobbying or non-lobbying. Thank you, Annie and Ruth, for voting. Got a couple more. Jeff, Sarah, thank you guys.
Alan, after you do a little explanation, I can even throw in a slight curveball of information about this fact sheet if you want, just to keep things fun.
All right. So we've got a couple of this people saying here, it's grassroots lobbying because it's to the masses, and it's about a specific bill. We've got Ruth saying it's not lobbying. There's no call to action. It promotes voting for a bill, but there's no call to action. So she says it's not lobbying. Grassroots because it provides information. Gail says it's educational, but there's no call to action. Hale, what's your addition here?
My little curveball of information is that I actually originally produced this at the request of staffers of Senator Young and Senator Braun.
Excellent. All right. So Hale spoke to staffers of Senator Braun and produced this fact sheet. Who wants to vote now? Does that change your analysis of this at all? Yeah, Deb's like, oh yeah, totally direct lobbying. Totally changed it right there. So let's go back a step. Let's pretend we're in that world where Hale hadn't said anything to us. The question there that nobody asked was this fact sheet created and distributed broadly to the public, or was it created and just given to legislators? If the fact sheet was just created and given to legislators, then it would be direct lobbying. I think all of you assumed that it was created and distributed broadly to the public before you used it for lobby day, in which case, totally legit, it would be non-lobbying, because if it's distributed broadly to the public before you use it with legislators, then it's a communication to the public. It reflects a view on legislation, but there's no call to action here. So if you create a fact sheet about a bill and distribute it broadly to the public, get it to journalists, get it to editorial board writers and podcasters, get it out to clergy and business leaders and PTAs, get it broadly distributed as part of your grassroots organizing and communication strategy, you can then use it at lobby day. Now, Hale's curveball here says that if you're working with a legislator and create communications with that legislator about legislation, that's just direct lobbying. It doesn't matter if the legislator reaches out to you to talk about legislation, or if you're reaching out to that legislator to talk about a bill. Either way, it's direct lobbying, regardless of who initiates that contact. But the thing I want to say is, if we've got US senators asking us to write a bill about a child tax credit expansion, then golly, what a good use of direct lobbying money, right? Like if Senator Braun's staff says, hey, write a fact sheet, either your response should either be, we only have non-lobbying foundation grants. Let me call an ally in our coalition who has lobbying dollars. Or you say, of course, this is the best use of lobbying dollars I'm going to have all week. Of course, I'm going to write this fact sheet, and I'm just going to code my time to direct lobbying, and that's a really good use of time. So thank you, Hale, for adding that. The fact sheet itself is not a call to action. Annie asks, is the sheet considered a call to action? It only is a call to action if you say contact your legislator or identify a legislator as being neutral or opposed to our position, or provide the legislator's contact information, or those other bullets that we included earlier, which I'll circulate in a minute. All right, so here's an op-ed. I want to ask you guys to vote on this one too. I know the text is really small, so I'll just read you key portions of it. This is an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun. The Heart Association and Sugar Free Kids Maryland wrote this. City Council should pass the bill banning sugary drinks from kids' menus. On Monday, the City Council is going to vote on the Healthy Kids Meal Bill. This bill would make a big impact on our community. The legislation is good policy. Passing this bill will be a big difference for all of our children's futures. Go ahead and vote in the chat box. Do you think this is lobbying? If it's lobbying, is it direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying? Or is it non-lobbying? And please explain why. So Annie's voting for grassroots lobbying because it's in the Sun and it says pass this bill. Andrew says it's non-lobbying because there's no call to action. Karen says it's non-lobbying because it went to the public. Yeah, it went to the public. And as Andrew indicates, and this is an interesting fight here between Andrew and Annie, right? Annie says it's grassroots lobbying because it was in the Sun and it says pass this bill, which is a direct action request. But as Andrew notes, there's no call to action here, right? Call to action is call your senators, call your legislators, identifying which legislators are neutral or opposed, providing their contact information, etc. And so it went to the public. It says the city council should pass this bill, but there's no call to action in terms of the IRS definition, the IRS definition of contact or legislator. Now, anyone who reads the city council, reads the Baltimore Sun, they're not going to call their city council member just because the last line of this op-ed said, call your city council member at 410-555-1212. So, and my background being in nonprofit communications, it takes a lot of time to write and produce an op-ed like this. You got to work with Pastor Slayton. You got to pitch it to the Baltimore Sun op-ed page. So it's a lot of time, and you're not going to generate many calls to the city council from this op-ed. So they used non-lobbying dollars for this op-ed. Now, what they did immediately afterwards, of course, is they blasted out the op-ed to their email lists, which they have broken down by precinct in their database. And they said, call your city council member now. Your city council member is so-and-so. Here's her phone number. Here's her email. They sent out to their email list, which they know is a bunch of people who are self-selected to care about this issue. Call your city council member right now. They also blasted it out on social media and said, check out today's op-ed from Pastor Slayton. If you want to keep kids healthy in Baltimore, call your city council members right now. that only took like a half hour worth of grassroots lobbying time to do all of that social media and email. But those social media and email are going to generate a whole lot more contacts to the city council than the op-ed itself will on its own. They spent 8 hours of staff time or 10 hours of staff time on the op-ed using non-lobbying foundation grant money to pay for writing the op-ed, but then they piggybacked on it with grassroots lobbying communications that are going to generate a lot more calls. But those grassroots lobbying social media posts aren't going to turn the underlying op-ed into a lobbying communication itself. Now, Andrew asked a question, what counts as broad distribution to the public? Can we just hide it in some like random little corner of our website? Or do you have to put it on the web? Do you have to put it on Facebook or Twitter? The IRS has never said what counts as broad distribution to the public. My snarky answer to people is you need to be able to sit across the table from an IRS agent and convince them with a straight face that you did try to distribute it broadly to the public. But the real answer is the materials that you're producing, your campaign is going to be stronger the more broadly you use those materials as part of grassroots organizing. So getting those communications, getting those materials out to journalists and editorial board writers and people at the Chamber of Commerce and childcare providers, anyone who's going to be affected by this, get those materials out broadly to the public, and that's going to make your whole campaign stronger anyways. So don't try to dance around what you think is broad public distribution. You're producing, if you're spending all this time writing a fact sheet or writing a report about eviction, you're going to want those materials to get out there to the public anyways. Let's see, as we're running short on time, I want to do 2 more examples. Vote in the chat box. Do you guys think that this tweet, do you have to count your staff time on this tweet as lobbying or non-lobbying? And is it direct or grassroots lobbying? And why? All right, no one wants to even try on this one. Everyone's given up. It's like they're like Friday afternoon. It's after an election. We're looking at Christmas. This one, interestingly, is lobbying. And it's grassroots lobbying because one of the prongs of a call to action is providing the contact information for a legislator. And at Senator Braun and at Sen Todd Young are their Twitter handles, and that's their contact information. If you had just written out, we hope to add Senator space Braun and Senator space Young, right? If you'd spelled it out, then it would be non-lobbying because there's no call to action. But this thing is so cheap, right? It probably took you guys 5 minutes to write this. And if you don't tag them, they're never going to see it. So of course you should tag them. Of course you should spend 5 minutes of grassroots lobbying time on this because it's going to get you more attention and more appreciation from those legislators. It's one of those times where it's really useful to engage in spending a little bit of money for a good payoff here. We want to make sure, again, it circles back to my thesis. We want you guys to be doing lobbying. It's just do lobbying when it makes sense. And the last example I will give, forget about that one. What about attending a bill signing? We've got attending a bill signing, and we've got putting out a statement expressing disappointment in passage of bad bills. These are both the same answer. Lobbying or non-lobbying, direct or grassroots here. Putting out a statement saying you're disappointed in these bad bills and attending a bill signing. Yeah, that's right. Ruth has it Ruth, and you guys are all getting this right. It's no longer legislation. So anything you do after a bill either is killed or passes is non-lobbying. Talking about, hey, we're really disappointed this bill passed, taking out an ad saying, hey, it's terrific this bill passed, going to attend a bill signing. It's all non-lobbying because there's no more legislation. And that also gets to this example here, where we had advocates go meet with their state senators to talk about the implementation of a bill. The bill had been passed the previous year, and now we're going to talk to legislators and say, hey, this bill was terrific. This is how well it's working. It's non-lobbying to send these folks in to talk to these state senators about how well the program is working that they passed the previous year. As long as you emphasize to those advocates, hey, we're not talking about any upcoming legislation, you can use non-lobbying dollars to bring these advocates from around the country, around the state rather, to talk to their legislator about why the bill is so, why the bill that passed the previous year was so effective. And just for Emily's sake, I'm going to put this picture back on the screen as our last concluding slide here. And with that, I'll turn it back to any questions people have in the chat box. We've got another couple of minutes, and I can stay a couple minutes over at the end. But let me turn it back over to you, Hal, for now.
Yeah, thank you. I do have some closeouts to do as well, just reminding folks of some other really good events coming up. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, looking for anything that might have been missed. And the only one that I can find was that we got a question earlier on, can the requested testimony include a position on the bill being heard and still not be considered lobbying? I think that's the only one we've missed.
Yeah, so if you get one of these letters, and again, I know that it's hard in Indiana to write a letter. In Minnesota, those people up there know how to write letters, but in Indiana, apparently they don't. But yeah, you get one of these letters. It's like a Willy Wonka golden ticket. You can do all of the testifying about a bill, and you can represent opinions about that bill, why the bill is good or bad. The key is that the letter itself has to request your opinions. And so, there's certain I's that need to be dotted and T's that need to be crossed in those request letters. But if the bill requests your opinions and recommendations for legislation, then it's totally non-lobbying to go and testify using foundation grant money and say, hey, totally non-lobbying, we think this bill needs this and that, we think you should vote yes or no, et cetera.
Okay. Alan, would you mind unsharing your screen so I can show folks just a little bit more before we go?
Yeah, but then we don't get the pictures of Emily and everyone else at the bill signing.
I know, I'm so sorry, folks. All right, just really quickly, because I know it's Friday. I know people probably have more stuff to get to, or maybe you get to log off, and that's awesome. I just want to thank Alan because I think that was a really helpful presentation. As a reminder, you are all going to get those slides and the recording because I know it's a lot. So you will be able to review this later, plus some of the memos and things that Alan mentioned. I will make sure you get those too. It'll be all in the same email in a couple of days. So thank you so much. Before folks go, I want to remind everyone this is part of a 3-part series. So I do urge you to register for the other 2 if you haven't already. The next one on screen is Advocacy 201, the strategies, and that's on December 11th. This is going to feature a distinguished panel of 4 highly experienced lobbyists who do advocate here in Indiana, and they're going to share with you some of their best tips and tricks for engaging with Indiana's legislators. The last webinar in the 3-part series is Advocacy 301, the experience, and this is going to take place on December 17th. And in this one, we're going to be performing out what we've been discussing throughout the whole series. We are literally going to do live simulations so that you can watch what it's like to interact with policymakers whose roles are going to be played by other highly experienced advocates who've done it many times in real life. So we're going to act it out for you to get rid of any lingering concerns about what it's like to engage with the legislator. And then all of this really does build up to a really great opportunity to practice what you've learned if you want to. This is Prosperity Indiana State House Day. So if you want to practice those skills and do some lobbying, you can. If you don't want to, we have plenty of other things too that you can do that day. We schedule a tour so that you can see the state capitol building and get familiarized. You can go and listen in on committee hearings with the group and do networking and all those fun things that if you're not quite ready to engage with legislators or lobby, that's perfectly fine. We've got more for you too. So please consider registering for those events. And one more time, if you are interested in Prosperity Indiana membership or Indiana Coalition for Human Services membership, please check out those organizations on their websites. Thank you so much again, Alan, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you all and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Yeah.